September 23, 2025. Copper futures market opens in London. The London Metal Exchange trading floor erupts as copper prices surge past $11,705 per metric ton, a 32% increase from the start of the year. Not because of a mine collapse in Chile. Not because of shipping delays from Indonesia. Because Microsoft just announced the expansion phase of its $500 billion Stargate project with OpenAI. And traders who understand the mathematics of AI infrastructure know exactly what that means for global copper demand. Each hyperscale data center Microsoft builds will consume between 25,000 and 50,000 tons of copper during construction, 3 times more than a traditional data center. Multiply that by the 134 gigawatts of confirmed data center projects currently tracked by Wood Mackenzie across the United States, and you begin to understand why copper markets are pricing in a supply crisis that could reach 6 million tons globally by 2035. This isn't a story about commodity speculation. This is the collision between Ari's exponential computational demands and the finite physics of mineral extraction, playing out in real time across global supply chains. The revelation starts with a simple question nobody in Silicon Valley wants to answer publicly. How much copper does artificial intelligence actually require? The answer exposes a resource dependency that makes the semiconductor chip shortage of 2021 look like a minor supply hiccup. Traditional data centers, the facilities that power email, web browsing, and cloud storage, operate at 10 to 15 kilowatts per server rack. AI-optimized hyperscale facilities require 60 to 120 kilowatts per rack, a 6-10x increase in power density that fundamentally changes the electrical infrastructure requirements. Every additional kilowatt of power requires proportionally more copper for electrical distribution, grounding systems, power delivery units, and the cooling infrastructure that prevents AI processors from melting under their own thermal loads. Microsoft's $500 million data center in Chicago, completed in 2009, required 2,177 tons of copper during construction, approximately 27 tons per megawatt of power capacity. With AI-ready facilities demanding exponentially higher power densities, the copper intensity per site has jumped to 50,000 tons or more for a single hyperscale campus. When you scale this across the 334 gigawatts of data center power capacity required by 2030, up from 77 gigawatts in 2023, the arithmetic becomes unavoidable. Bloomberg NEF's latest analysis projects AI data centers will consume approximately 400,000 tons of copper annually over the next decade, peaking at 572,000 tons in 2028. The cumulative total copper locked into AI infrastructure could reach 4.3 million tons by 2035. For context, that's equivalent to the combined annual output of the world's 4 largest copper mines operating continuously for an entire year. But these projections capture only the copper embedded within data center facilities themselves. The deeper resource impact occurs in the electrical grid infrastructure required to deliver power to these computational factories. Colin Hamilton of BMO Capital Markets identified the overlooked dimension. Data centers themselves are becoming incrementally less copper intensive, but getting the electricity to them, that is copper intensive. The transmission lines, substations, transformers, and grid upgrades necessary to connect AI facilities to electrical networks require an additional 5 million tons of copper for infrastructure expansion through 2030, according to Wood Mackenzie's comprehensive grid analysis. Goldman Sachs projects a 165% increase in data center power demand by 2030, which serves as a direct proxy for copper consumption in electrical transmission infrastructure. Every megawatt of additional data center capacity requires roughly 3 to 5 tons of copper in transmission equipment, distribution systems, and grid connectivity hardware. The compound effect transforms AI infrastructure from a demand sector into a resource consumption category that rivals entire countries. S&P Global's research reveals the strategic implication. Copper demand will surge from 28 million metric tons globally in 2025 to 42 million metric tons by 2040. A 50% increase driven primarily by AI infrastructure, renewable energy systems, and electric vehicle manufacturing. All 3 sectors are experiencing simultaneous exponential growth, creating unprecedented competition for the same finite copper supply. The supply side of the equation reveals why markets are pricing in scarcity premiums. Global copper supply faces structural constraints that cannot be resolved through incremental production increases or minor efficiency improvements. The fundamental problem lies in geological reality and extraction timeline physics. Copper ore grades have declined by approximately 40% since 1990, according to Chilean mining industry data. This means extracting the same amount of usable copper requires processing 40% more raw material, consuming proportionally more energy, water, and chemical processing inputs. The declining resource quality increases both extraction costs and environmental impact per unit of refined copper output. New mine development timelines average 19 years in the United States from discovery to commercial production, among the longest in the world. For comparison, most other mining jurisdictions require 7 to 10 years from project approval to first copper production. The extended timeline reflects complex permitting processes, environmental assessments, infrastructure construction, and community approval mechanisms that cannot be accelerated without legislative changes. Arizona's Resolution Copper project illustrates these development constraints. The deposit was discovered decades ago and contains an estimated 40 billion pounds of copper, enough to supply American data centers for approximately 15 years at projected consumption rates. Despite billions of dollars invested in shafts, infrastructure, and development work, production remains targeted for 2030 at the earliest, representing a 35-year timeline from discovery to commercial output. The project faces legal challenges from Apache tribal groups who consider the land sacred, federal appeals court proceedings that have frozen land exchange approvals, and ongoing environmental assessments that could extend timelines further. Similar complexity affects major copper projects across Chile, Peru, Indonesia, and other primary producing regions, creating systematic delays in new supply availability. Chile, the world's largest copper producer, has reduced its 2025 production growth estimates due to aging infrastructure, water scarcity, declining ore grades, and safety incidents including the recent collapse at Codelco El Teniente mine. Peru faces persistent social conflicts, labor disputes, and transportation infrastructure limitations that constrain production expansion. Indonesia confronts ore export restrictions and processing capacity bottlenecks that limit refined copper availability for international markets. The International Energy Agency's Critical Minerals Outlook places copper on a trajectory where existing and planned mines will meet only about 70% of projected 2035 demand. Wood Mackenzie projects more immediate shortages, with a 304,000-ton refined copper deficit forecast for 2025 and widening gaps through 2026. These projections assume normal economic growth patterns and do not fully incorporate the exponential demand acceleration from AI infrastructure development. The pricing dynamics reflect these supply constraints in commodity markets that operate with mathematical precision. Copper reached $11,705 per metric ton on the London Metal Exchange, driven by hyperscale developers who demonstrate complete price inelasticity. Because copper represents less than 0.5% of total data center construction costs, developers will pay $10,000 per ton or $20,000 per ton with equal indifference. The economic impact of doubling copper prices adds roughly $50 million to the total cost of a $10 billion data center project, a rounding error that doesn't affect construction decisions. This price inelasticity creates systematic market distortion. Data center developers can outbid renewable energy projects, electric vehicle manufacturers, construction companies, and all other copper-dependent industries because their business models absorb commodity price increases without affecting project economics. The result is resource allocation through pricing power rather than economic efficiency, transferring copper supply from price-sensitive applications to price-insensitive AI infrastructure. JP Morgan expects copper to reach $12,500 per ton by the second quarter of 2026, averaging around $12,075 for the full year. UBS projects even higher prices, with copper potentially reaching $13,000 by the end of 2026. Investment banks understand that demand inelasticity combined with supply constraints creates conditions for sustained price increases that continue until either new supply comes online or demand destruction occurs in price-sensitive sectors. Regional patterns demonstrate how AI infrastructure development concentrates copper consumption in specific geographic markets. The United States hosts 51% of global hyperscale data centers, concentrated in Northern Virginia, Dallas, Silicon Valley, Phoenix, Columbus, Ohio, San Antonio, Texas, and the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. These regions are experiencing copper demand spikes that stress local electrical infrastructure and compete directly with residential and commercial construction for available supply. North American data center infrastructure spending is projected to rise from $33 billion in 2020 to $70 billion by 2030 and $185 billion by 2040. Each dollar of infrastructure investment requires proportional copper consumption for electrical systems, cooling infrastructure, power distribution, and grid connectivity. The scale of projected investment guarantees continued pressure on copper markets regardless of efficiency improvements in individual facility design. The geopolitical dimension adds complexity to supply security considerations. China controls significant portions of global copper refining capacity and has implemented strategic stockpiling programs that reduce available supply for international markets. The United States imposed 50% tariffs on copper imports in August 2025 to boost domestic production. But tariff policies cannot accelerate mine development timelines or overcome geological constraints in domestic or grade quality. Recycling provides partial supply augmentation but cannot offset the scale of new demand from AI infrastructure. Copper maintains identical properties when recycled, making it ideal for circular economy applications. However, existing electronic equipment contains relatively small amounts compared to data center infrastructure requirements. A smartphone contains 15 to 20 grams of copper. A data center requires 25,000 to 50,000 tons. The scale mismatch means recycling improves supply efficiency but cannot substitute for primary production from mining operations. The semiconductor industry creates additional copper bottlenecks that affect AI chip production directly. TSMC's 2 nanometers process technology requires copper interconnects at microscopic scales with purity specifications that exceed standard industrial grades. Any disruption in semiconductor-grade copper supply directly impacts AI chip manufacturing capacity, creating feedback loops between physical commodities and digital infrastructure development. Copper's thermal and electrical conductivity properties make it irreplaceable for high-performance computing applications. Alternative materials like silver offer superior conductivity but cost 100 times more than copper, making substitution economically impossible at data center scale. The cooling infrastructure represents a particularly copper-intensive component of AI facilities. Liquid cooling systems, required for high-density AI processors, use copper cooling plates attached directly to each chip. These systems require extensive copper piping, heat exchangers, and thermal management equipment that cannot be substituted with alternative materials without sacrificing cooling efficiency. As AI workloads become more computationally intensive, cooling requirements increase proportionally, driving additional copper consumption per unit of computational capacity. BHP's analysis projects global data center copper consumption will grow sixfold by 2050, from approximately 500,000 tons annually today to around 3 million tons annually by mid-century. This trajectory assumes continued AI development, cloud computing expansion, and digitalization of economic activities across all industrial sectors. The projection also incorporates efficiency improvements in data center design and cooling technology that partially offset raw computational growth. The investment implications ripple across multiple economic sectors. Copper mining companies face unprecedented demand, but also unprecedented operational challenges in scaling production to meet market requirements. Freeport-McMoRan, BHP Billiton, Codelco, and other major producers are accelerating expansion projects while managing declining ore grades and increasing extraction costs. Electrical equipment manufacturers, companies producing transformers, cables, cooling systems, and power distribution infrastructure, face margin pressures from rising input costs combined with unprecedented demand for their products. Some manufacturers are securing copper supply through direct investment in mining operations or long-term purchase agreements that provide price stability. Construction and renewable energy sectors face cost increases and potential material shortages as data center developers compete for available copper supply. Solar panel manufacturing, wind turbine construction, and electrical grid modernization projects operate with thinner margins that cannot absorb the copper price increases that data centers treat as negligible. Technology companies are responding through vertical integration strategies that secure supply chains for critical materials. Major cloud providers are investing directly in copper mining operations, establishing purchase agreements with primary producers, and developing recycling programs that capture end-of-life copper from decommissioned equipment. The macroeconomic implications extend beyond commodity markets into infrastructure policy and economic development planning. Regions competing for data center investment face trade-offs between attracting high-value AI infrastructure and maintaining affordable copper access for traditional industries like manufacturing, construction, and renewable energy development. The timeline mismatch between AI development cycles and mining development cycles creates systematic risk for technology sector growth projections. AI computational demands are growing exponentially on the 18th of December month development cycles. Copper mine development requires 7 to 19 years from discovery to production. The fundamental mismatch between digital growth rates and physical resource extraction timelines guarantees continued market tension. The resolution requires either dramatic improvements in computational efficiency, reducing copper requirements per unit of AI processing power, or massive acceleration in copper production capacity through technological innovation, policy changes, or alternative material development. Recent advances in AI model efficiency, including DeepSeek's reported 18x training cost reductions, suggest computational improvements remain possible. However, deployment across the technology industry requires years of implementation, while copper demand continues growing exponentially. Alternative approaches include development of more efficient cooling technologies that reduce copper intensity, advancement in urban mining and recycling that increase secondary supply, and exploration of substitute materials for non-critical applications within data center infrastructure. The pattern recognition is definitive. Artificial intelligence development has created a resource dependency that extends beyond semiconductor chips into fundamental industrial materials. Copper markets are pricing in scarcity premiums that reflect genuine supply constraints, not speculative excess. The collision between exponential digital growth and linear physical resource extraction has begun. The mathematics are unavoidable. The timeline constraints are geological. The demand growth is exponential. The supply response is constrained by physics, permitting, and extraction economics that cannot be compressed through financial markets or policy intervention alone. The autopsy is complete. AI infrastructure has become the dominant demand driver for global copper consumption, creating systematic scarcity that affects every copper-dependent industry. The beneficiaries are AI companies and copper producers. The cost is borne by every other sector that requires copper for electrical infrastructure, manufacturing, construction, and renewable energy development. The transfer is occurring through commodity markets that allocate resources based on purchasing power rather than economic efficiency.